Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. And I should say, welcome back. This is the first episode of our third season, which is honestly super exciting for us at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke to David Roberts. David is a writer at Vox.com, formerly of Grist, and has spent his journalistic career writing mainly about energy and climate change, in addition to broader U.S. politics and society. David and I have known each other exclusively via Twitter for almost a decade now, and it was really a pleasure to finally speak to him sort of in person. We both work in this space, and we both think about climate policy and politics fairly similarly, but there are substantial enough differences that we have mainly interacted over the years by disagreeing somewhat. I think we've also evolved on our perspectives on different energy technologies, productive energy policy, and more things like that. So I've been really looking forward to having him on the show to hash some of this stuff out. Enjoy. David Roberts, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Alex. Great to be here.
So I bookmarked this tweet of yours, and I think it was a couple months ago, because I thought it actually, yeah, obviously this will start with Twitter. I thought this captured my sense of your sort of worldview, particularly around climate, pretty well. So the tweet read, quote, "The ability to frame, interpret, and respond does not come from possession of more or better empirical evidence. Reality, sadly, doesn't matter much. It's all about power. There's no substitute for a left comfortable with gathering and using power," end quote. And that tweet wasn't actually about climate change, but I felt like it captured your views on climate pretty well, and I feel like it's a sentiment that I've seen from you, at least on your Twitter feed, pretty frequently, maybe even more so over the past few years. So can you unpack what that discussion of power means?
Sure. And that I think is a good place to start. The reason I think I emphasize it so much these days is that I've kind of ended up there or moved in that direction pretty steadily. So, when I started covering this stuff, climate generally, politics, really, U.S. politics generally, this was back in the early 2000s, and climate discussion was just utterly dominated by a couple of conversations. One is, how do we convince the deniers? How do we find, what is the magic argument or magic sort of set of terms or frame or whatever, what have you, to finally, reach deniers and change their minds.
Right.
And so this was accompanied, and it still is to this day, by endless studies of framing and social science on framing and giant philanthropically funded framing campaigns on and on and on. And it's sort of, the more I have, one thing that I noticed, was that it never seemed to work, right? Like in my, I think honest to God, in my 15-year career now at this point, I have never witnessed an argument with a denier in any format end with either side changing their mind. Not once, ever. Like I think we could probably pick out a few people who used to be on that side who have drifted over. I didn't see that happen, like Jerry Taylor or whatever, but you can count them on one hand. It just, persuasion wasn't working. And I also noticed that, I would say, so that was formative. Watching that dynamic was formative. The other thing that was formative for me is that was formative for me in a number of ways, is sort of watching the unfolding of the Waxman-Markey bill in 2008 to 2010. And I sort of, I realized, I guess, that I looking back on it, I think I had in my head or heart a sort of conviction, because I dove into that bill, I read the damn thing and actually understood what the words were on the page and cared a lot to discuss that with other people. But what I sort of noticed is that the reality of that bill, the reality of the actual policy in it, never like the left had sort of a phantasm in its head, sort of corporate sellout, et cetera, et cetera. And the right had a different phantasm in its head. And those two phantasms battled it out on the public stage, and the facts of the bill never played a material role in the entire life and death of that bill from start to finish. At no point did the reality of the bill, what was in the bill, materially affect the way people discussed it, the way people voted on it, how it, like its sort of passage through the system. You know what I mean? Sort of just like whatever was going on with it, it didn't have anything to do with the facts, right?
Yeah. I mean, I agree that, most of our sort of environmental climate debates ultimately end up actually being conversations about how we want society to be organized or how we see people who are not in our political tribe. I kind of wanted to open with this because I think it gets to a bit of a dispute, or at least a conversation that you and I have had in different forms over the years, and that's that question for me, especially practically today, around the Green New Deal and other things, is the sort of scarce resource for effective, ambitious climate policy in the United States. Is it sort of the inability of Democrats to consolidate enough political power and then actually pass things? Or is the scarce resource bipartisanship? Is the scarce resource sort of space for Republicans and conservatives to have their own climate politics?
Right. Well, I guess what I'd say is power is a very broad term, very broad generic term. And in a sense, the ability to pull a handful of people over to your side is a form of power as well. Right. So I guess I just step back and say, like what happened with Waxman Markey is who had the most power won, whose ox was going to get gored, like whose material interests were on the line, spent money and won. And insofar as messaging was involved in that, it was as an instrument of power, not as a communication or informational device, but as a cudgel, as a way of expressing power. And so I just look around at climate legislation and I think, well, what are the power centers lined up against it, right? And what are the forms of power available to people who want to pass it, right? So that's like that to me, that's the basic debate. And if it were true that there were Republicans available to assemble bipartisan votes, then that would be one of the available forms of power, right? Uh-huh. So what I've looked around at, I mean, really, honestly, like I've come to a pretty dismal place, honestly, lately. Like I just don't like. It looks to me like the power imbalance is virtually adamantine at this point. Like I don't know. It would take something disruptive, something that I don't know or anticipate to break it up. But I just don't see the bipartisanship just isn't there, and like the money isn't there. This is why I keep coming back to in my posts when we talk about the Green New Deal is like all I see as a mechanism of power for the people who want to pass this stuff now is a popular movement, is people in the streets. There's just, I don't take any great joy in that because I don't have take any great faith in the ability of that to work, but I just don't see other means open. And I certainly particularly just don't see bipartisanship as a live option. I don't see any evidence around to indicate that. I mean, if we're going to discuss bipartisanship, I'd like to put one rule on the table, which is it's a very fuzzy term. In a sense, if you get a bill and you get 1,000 liberal groups to sign on for it, and you get one Republican group to sign on for it, right? You've got a bipartisan. A plan. So what I mean by bipartisanship as power is I mean a sufficient number of Republican votes to make the difference and get something passed. right? That's what I mean. And I just don't see any prospect for that anywhere on the horizon.
Yeah, and I'll get back to bipartisanship in a moment, but I do want to reflect. It is pretty depressing if that is the case. You say that that Democrats sort of lost the Waxman-Markey battle because they did not have sufficient power, and that must be true because it happened. But they did have sort of numeric political power. They had strong majorities in Congress. And so I guess before we get to the bipartisanship issue, what are we picturing when we picture sort of feet in the streets, sufficient political power, whether it's Democrats and Republicans. It seems like even when you get sort of a bill and a lot of political capital behind it, it fails. And it doesn't have to be a bill. The Clean Power Plan was also passed and ultimately sort of picked apart by the courts, thrown out by the Trump administration. Another thing that comes to mind, and I think it's related, is something like high-speed rail in California, where we have strong and seemingly enduring Democratic majorities in the state legislature and the state house, and we can't seem to build anything. I know that that opens up various cans of worms, but how do you sort of reckon with all of that?
Yeah, specifically going back to Waxman-Markey, because I think it's one of the best examples we have of this is always in the background of these discussions are the fact that the unique circumstances of the U.S. political system. I mean, all political systems, all human societies, all human organizations, arguably, have a degree of status quo bias, have a degree of sort of, clinging to the way things are because that was the circumstances in which it formed and in which it has whatever power it has. So there's always status quo bias, but the U.S. system of government is particularly stacked with veto points. It's just our system of government, makes it very, very, very difficult to do anything at all, right? There's so many veto points to stop it. And particularly, it makes it difficult to do progressive things because I don't know that we need to recite them all here again, but there are just a number of features of the U.S. political system that give rural and suburban white people disproportionate representation in government, disproportionate power, and they're and the way things have evolved over the last several decades is just to reinforce that, is to make that more so. And you can see right now the actions of the Republican Party in the U.S. They are aware of this, and they're frantically working to shore up those advantages by trying to reduce the number of people who can vote and gerrymandering and on and on and on. So the point is, I think when you look at the Waxman-Markey bill, a lot of people look at that episode and go, oh, the bill wasn't good enough, or, oh, enviros suck, or, oh, the movement sucks, or Democrats suck, or whatever. But I think the lesson to take from that is look how much you can have in place, right? Look how much power you can amass. Look how much you can do and still just wash up on the shores of DC. And in that particular case, it was the filibuster, Right. So like there is no, what mechanism of power do I see that's going to get us to 60 Senate votes? Zero. There's no such thing that's going to do that. So there's these enormous barriers. And right now, if I look at sort of a pathway to any kind of victory, substantial victory, there's just you just got to draw nines, or I don't know any gambling metaphors, but you just got to win over and over again. You got to win the Senate, right? You got to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You got to kill the filibuster. It would help to make Puerto Rico and DC states, so you have more Senate votes. You need to start packing the court. You need to start passing laws against gerrymandering. I mean, there's all these reforms that reduce these structural barriers that need to happen before I see any chance of big, substantial climate legislation. And all of that, especially all of those things, any one of those things is unlikely. All of those things lining up together is extremely unlikely, but I just don't see. I mean, it is depressing. You're right. It's depressing. It's very unlikely, but but when you think about it, climate change is the way it is because literally I mean, to a first approximation, literally all the world's big financial powers are invested in it. Like literally all the power in the world, almost, with like very rare exceptions, is behind that. So like, of course, it's going to be hard and difficult. So I mean, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, so I want to either push you on that or try and make you feel better. And because there's a couple things that come to mind for me, and I'll have to do a little exposition for our listeners here. The first is something I've been harping on for over a year. It's the Section 45Q tax credits that were passed in the omnibus budget bill last year, which were tax credits for carbon captured either at the power plant or out of the atmosphere. And people think that I'm trolling when I say this, but that is actually a price on carbon the government will pay you if you take it out of the atmosphere or keep it at a power plant. So a Republican Congress passed a very narrow, but still a narrow carbon price, and it was signed into law by President Donald J. Trump. That same bill also increased funding for energy innovation at the Department of Energy and at ARPA-E. You have Democrats and Republicans co-sponsoring bills like the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, among other things. And this is all sort of very, very sort of small ball sounding legislation. It's nothing like the Markey type of bill that was the Waxman-Markey bill, but it is something. You were saying that it's hard for you to picture anything happening unless you sort of win and win and win and win and win again. But actually things do happen, and I think that they could be some pretty substantial things. So what do you make of all that stuff?
Yeah, I guess the way I'd look at that is I think what you can conclude from that is that the right will vote for things that reduce carbon emissions insofar as those things overlap with the interests of right-wing constituencies and power centers and money centers, right? I mean, I guess that's sort of like thuddingly obvious to say, but so I mean, there's two ways to look at that. You can look at that as like, oh, they're taking their first tentative steps into climate policy, the first of what will be more, right? That would be nice to think that. Or you could just think nuclear is popular on the right and fossil fuels are popular on the right. And so insofar as climate policies funnel money or largesse to those two industries, they'll pass, but it's not an indication that anything else is coming after that. You know what I mean? Like it's not bipartisanship if you say we'll do what we would have done anyway. Like, I guess that's nice, but like, show me them doing something against, right? Show me them making a compromise. Show me them doing something they don't want to do in the name of moving forward together, right? As opposed to just sort of doing things that they probably would have done anyway, even if climate change didn't exist, right? Like they want to funnel subsidies to these industries, period. So like climate is almost peripheral to the whole thing. So like I guess the shorter answer is I don't make much of those. Like I agree that they're worthwhile policies. I just don't see them as indicators that there's more to come.
Yeah, I think this gets back to probably just sort of a central, maybe subtle disagreement that you and I have had for a long time. Those all strike me as sort of features, not bugs, to a conservative or a Republican climate politics. You're probably not going to get Republicans on board with things like I don't know, banning pipelines or in many states 100% wind, water, and solar. But nuclear, carbon capture, funding for innovation across the board, not just nuclear and carbon capture, is the kind of thing that tends to pull Republicans over, and not just get Republicans like Lisa Murkowski to really push hard for increasing innovation investments, while the Trump administration has proposed cutting those things. But you get a good amount of actually sort of substantial bipartisan leadership on some of these technology focused initiatives.
Well, this is how I'd want to put it, and this is also true for the sort of Republican talk about innovation. You know, this is their new slogan now on climate policy. I think the way I divide it up is conservatives generally, right, in any political system, the conservative temperament is to defend the status quo, is to defend the powers that be, is to defend the sort of arrangement of power that exists because they're invested in it and benefit from it. And then the other side is a motley collection of people who would like to share in those benefits or share in those resources, right? I mean, that's sort of like the basic shape of any political conflict. So it's predictable to me and makes perfect sense that conservatives will go along with climate policy insofar as it doesn't threaten the basic power structure, right? And so insofar as like fossil fuel companies get more money to research more stuff, right? Or nuclear power gets more subsidies on top of the subsidies it's gotten before. None of those things are no one's ox gets gored. No one's financial hegemony is threatened, right? So none of those things threaten the status quo. So I guess what you come to is, do you see a substantial or adequate solution to climate change that can be engineered without threatening the status quo? If you can, right, then you're going to get conservatives on board the whole way. And maybe we disagree about this, but I just don't think you can. Like, I think you're going to be nibbling around the edges like they're doing with things that don't really threaten anybody. And the line is going to be threatening a big financial power, or a big power base, or a big donor base. So to me, the line is less ideology and more about, again, power, right? Like, they are serving power, and those policies in one way or another serve power, even if they do good things. And I agree with them. I just don't see them going beyond that.
Yeah. I mean, my thing is that I think you don't need to go radically beyond it. You know, if I look at the sort of history of policies and sort of public sector investments that have driven radical or sort of substantial decarbonization over time, they actually tend to look, I think, more like the 45Q tax credits or the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, or funding for sort of innovation offices at the Department of Energy than they do like sort of infrastructure regulation and things like that. This sort of small ball or sort of sectoral and narrow legislation or regulation tends to actually have, I think, a better track record than things like the Waxman-Markey approach. This is sort of a founding insight of the Breakthrough Institute, for whatever it was worth.
Yeah. I mean, I have mixed feelings about that. I guess what I'd say is, like policies that have decarbonized to date, well, better than anyone, and Breakthrough has covered this better than anyone, but the sort of macro history here is that the surge of carbon-free energy, whether nuclear and renewables and all the rest, has mostly at best served to satisfy new demand, right? And not really substantially reduced the amount of energy that's coming from fossil fuels in absolute terms, right? Like, we're sort of shifting to new energy sources somewhat to satisfy new demand. So almost by definition, all those previous policies did not substantially threaten power centers, right? It's just sort of like, we're going to take some of your marginal growth. So, I mean, I guess it just depends on, I think we're sort of dancing around this, and maybe we should talk about it. Just like, how do you picture climate change getting tackled? Because I don't see enough emission reductions coming without taking the political and economic power of the oil and gas industry and the fucking autos and sprawl, right, and big ag, and really like pick your enemy. I don't see how you get there without taking on those power centers directly. I mean, if you could like construct a way around that so that we can sort of like slipstream in the back door to a zero carbon, system, I would be delighted, but I just don't.
Yeah, it certainly depends on what your definition of enough emissions reductions is. But I think we don't talk about the fracking revolution nearly as much as we should, because it's natural, because it's still a fossil fuel, and it's still and it's natural gas as opposed to wind or solar or nuclear or whatever. But the fracking revolution kneecapped the coal industry over the last 10, 15 years with a substantial assist from, in particular, wind. I think, solar is starting to take more of coal's lunch as well. But and obviously, the Great Recession played a role. But I think it's inarguable that that cheap natural gas enabled, as Breakthrough fans will know, by substantial sort of federal involvement in fracking innovation over 30, 40 years, really kneecapped the coal industry, which is dying in the United States, and I think will continue to, partially because of fracking, and also because of renewables, and maybe one day because of advanced nuclear reactors. So that's my model, actually, and we can argue whether that's enough. Certainly, coal still generates power in the United States and around the world, but you actually did see a technological revolution that without sort of fiat government power went after an existing power structure, what we once thought of as a fairly powerful industrial and political entity in the coal industry.
Yeah, and if that happens to natural gas, electricity, it will be similarly because of these competing sources, as a result of government innovation policies and industrial policies, as we agree, did it. But then you come back to sort of scale and speed, right? It's scale and speed over and over again. All hovering behind this is always the need for speed. I could see that happening. In fact, I guess in one sense, I'm a utopian, and I think over a sufficient time horizon, it's more or less inevitable that that's going to happen, right? It's more or less inevitable to me that some combination of renewables and batteries and maybe these advanced small nuclear plants are going to eventually drive natural gas and coal electricity mostly out of business. And I sort of think it's inevitable that electric cars are going to take a huge chunk out of oil demand eventually, in a way that will substantially hurt oil companies. And maybe, I sort of like all of this seems like it's going to happen, but that we have this constant background need for speed. So could that, it was the fracking revolution was fast, right? Relatively speaking, it was incredibly fast. So if we could engineer that again, that would be great. But I just don't know that I have faith that there's anything on the horizon that's going to do to natural gas what we did to coal anywhere near that speed, the speed we need.
Yeah, I think that's super fair. And obviously decarbonization is not occurring at the speed with which anyone would prefer if they're even a little bit worried about climate change. And, the impetus of Breakthrough and a lot of people's work is how do you sort of speed up these transitions? I think for us, it always gets back to how to make these technologies cheaper and more scalable. I think we've seen sort of more progress on that than I would have expected 10, 15 years ago, particularly when it comes to batteries, solar panels, and obviously fracking. Mm-hmm. I don't want to make this conversation or everything in my life about nuclear power. But again, this is another thing that I think you and I it's been something of a hot point between us for years. So I wanted to touch on it at least. Sort of my sense is that we have each gone through something of an evolution on nuclear technology. For me, it was anti-nuclear to very pro-nuclear and pro-existing technologies, and then ultimately extremely skeptical of existing reactors and the sort of U.S. nuclear industry in particular, and increasingly optimistic, but still about next generation advanced reactors, but still sort of very aware that we haven't built one yet. So I'm curious, both on the sort of technology and the semiotics of it, what your sort of evolution, if there has been one, on nuclear has been over time.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we've probably more or less arrived at the same place. And my broader sense is that, well, I don't know. One doesn't want to make generalizations, but insofar as there's kind of a thinker community, right, like a sort of intellectual community around this, I kind of think that it more broadly is ending up in the same place, right? So I've evolved from not care particularly, right, to sort of opposition just based on on bigness and expensiveness and slowness, and then sort of, well, I won't go through the whole thing, but I've sort of ended up in the place that seems to me sort of obviously correct. That's sort of the obvious common sense view, which you just described, which is the current industry is a fucking dumpster fire, right? Dumpster fire, financially, ethically, right? Regulatorily, pick your poison. It's a total dumpster fire. There are models in other countries for how you can make this big current generation of nuclear plants work, but they involve, I don't see them coming to America. Frankly, like they just seem like completely at odds with American economy and habits and everything else. So I don't favor dumping more money into trying to build more of these giant whales that we just have seen failing in the last few years, to the tune of just billions of dollars. Unimaginable amounts of alternative energy could have been made with that money. So that's a dumpster fire. Again, this seems obviously correct to me, insofar as anyone invents a small, meltdown proof, no waste nuclear power plant, then of course I am excited about that. Of course I support that. Of course any sane human being would. Pop one in every backyard. I'm all for it. Like, it just like, it's been on the verge of happening the entire time I've covered this subject and has never quite happened, sort of like advanced, like I have it kind of in a similar bucket to my head to advanced biofuels. Remember those, the algae and the whatever, the other ones, like they would be great, but they just aren't showing up. So like, I can't, like, what's weird to me. So like, I think like substantively, I think we're in the same place. Like I'm excited about new reactors. I'm turned off and sick of the current situation in the current reactors. What's weird to me in the semiotics of it and the debate around it is this notion that even if you accept that position that you described, that we're both sort of in, it's weird to prioritize that, right? Like we're talking about something that we're hoping is going to fill the gaps that variable renewable energy leaves in mid-century, right? Basically, why not focus on the bulk, which is the variable renewable energy, and just keep that going on the back burner? Like keep the research going, sure, fund the research, do the tests, whatever, all that. But like, that's not the main show. It's weird to me that there's this sort of hovering notion that you have to pay fealty to that to be credited as a serious person in this debate. Why? It's not the main thing. It's not the thing that's doing the most work. It's just weird. Its semiotic role doesn't make sense to me relative to its reality. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, certainly you see a very sort of strong version of that viewpoint on Twitter and out in the world, folks who are sort of so powerfully pro-nuclear that they become anti-renewables. And I'm sure if you scroll through my timeline, you'll see sort of at least shadows of that sentiment that I've had to sort of sort of chasten myself a little bit, not least because solar has gotten so cheap, like more so than I would have thought 5-10 years ago. But also, these technologies do all decarbonize, in sort of different ways and different scales and different paces. I think though that one can prioritize, sort of some technologies over another, even if different technologies are working today than that person imagines. I have become very bullish on basically nuclear and solar decarbonizing most of energy, whether it's sort of, by 2050 or 2100 or 2150. But I think that I'm sort of less bullish on wind, although the offshore stuff is exciting, just because there's so much solar potential and like at least physically so much fission and fusion potential. If you can
Right.
make the technology work. I think that actually has implications for how we think about investing in technologies today. I actually think it's possible that that advanced nuclear plays a sort of more than substantial role in power sector and maybe beyond, with sort of high quality heat and process heat and hydrogen and things like that.
Desalination or no?
And I think. Sure. Yeah. Desalination, high temperature
Hydrogen.
heat, hydrogen, syn fuels. All of these things seem plausible to me, particularly in the sort of 2050 and beyond time period. And I think that it makes sense to start thinking about how these technologies fit together now, because as you and I both know, energy infrastructure is highly long lived, and how advanced reactors are going to balance against variable renewables and sort of syn fuels or synthetic methane or hydrogen or desalination or demand response or whatever. These things really matter. And so I'm not sure that sort of just pushing hardest on the technologies we have available today and also sort of, doing some research over here is the right way to think.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, like if you went back to Carter, right, Jimmy Carter, I don't know if every energy analyst goes through a cycle at some point in their career where they go back and actually read about what Jimmy Carter wanted to do, and then they spend a few quiet moments in existential despair, staring at a wall. But if we had just, if you went back there and I, as an energy analyst, said, I want solar, God damn it, I want to push on solar. Solar is going to go all the way. Solar. I would be seen as crazy, but I would have been vindicated at every single stage of history since then, except for the sort of, I guess, long Reagan, dark ages. But like,
yeah, maybe not every stage, but certainly
today. So I guess and this is kind of a question I had for you, not to flip the podcast on you, but like one of the things I have been thinking about most lately and have come to see as kind of one of the key questions around all this is how far solar can go. How far will solar go? How cheap not just how cheap can it, well, mainly, I guess it pivots on how cheap it can get, but then, if solar, because there is at least now, there are papers floating around and the idea floating around that we're going to get to a point pretty soon. Some people say 2030, that's like, to my mind, ridiculously optimistic. But 2040, certainly by 2050, it'll just be so cheap as to be almost trivially cheap, and it'll be ubiquitous, and we're going to be dealing with the problem of like overproduction and how to deal with all these surges of energy that we barely know how to use, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess how I answer all the other tech questions in the end pivots around that. Like, where is the top of that solar S curve? Where right. Does it plateau? Does it keep going up because all you have to do is just literally do the math. If it keeps doing what it's doing now, right? if it keeps doubling at the rate it's doubling now, and costs keep falling at the rate they're falling now and have for like the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, well, then it's going to be globally ubiquitous by like 2030. So, I mean, maybe it won't do that, but where that S curve plateaus to me is like the pivotal question that tells you what you need from nuclear, what you need from storage, what you need from almost everything else.
Yeah. So obviously, I like I said, I'm much more optimistic about solar's future than I was 5, even 10 years ago.
Yeah, you and Jesse have a rather famous bearish article, as I recall.
Yeah. David is talking about me and Jesse Jenkins, and we'll share that in the show notes. But I actually mostly sort of stand by this article that you mentioned, which talked about the sort of capacity factor thresholds for variable renewables that above the sort of nominal capacity factor of a variable energy technology. They're producing too much energy for a good amount of time, and not enough or energy or any energy the rest of the time. And that really sort of messes with the economics of a power generation technology. As you sort of suggest, you can mitigate that with things like storage. You can mitigate that with things like curtailment. You can mitigate that with things like, sort of making synthetic methane and using that for other purposes, transmission, things like that. But again, I'm more optimistic about solar than I was 5-10 years ago, but you still, and this sounds like sort of a renewable denier talking point, but it still is the case that the sun is only up for part of the day. And it's true. And you have to figure out how to sort of store and use a lot of excess solar generation the rest of the time, which is why I think things like advanced nuclear and maybe natural gas with carbon capture and things like that are going to be more economical as you head towards 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100% deep decarbonization. You can sort of quibble based on capacity factors and geography and transmission. But, all of the things that sort of bump up to the top of that S curve, as you say, are, sort of hurt or sort of mitigate the good economics of solar, sort of no matter what the price is. I do think that prices will keep going down, although I'm sort of in the Varun Sivaram school on that one of the things that is going to make prices keep going down is pretty radical innovation in solar technology. But I also think that even with that, the economics of just radically overbuilding solar supply and then figuring out what to do with just a huge surplus of electricity that you generate in the middle of the day or in the middle of the year are such that you want to be planning now for the other component technologies of an energy system.
To me, this right here is like the nut of the of everything. Like if we were like if the Dems actually had a climate debate and actually had climate informed candidates to participate in a climate debate and climate informed moderators and a remotely climate informed audience, if all that was in place and we had a real climate debate, like this is what it would be about: is what's the top of that S curve and what's going to help bump it up? Like to me, the premise or the hypothesis of solar, ubiquity, sort of solar winning in the end, is also premised on simultaneous revolutions in battery prices, in storage prices, right? So that the idea that batteries will follow the same basic path as solar price-wise, and a simultaneous revolution in EVs getting super, super cheap and super, super ubiquitous faster than most mainstream forecasts have it. So you kind of need all those happening at once: the solar revolution ongoing, a storage revolution, and an EV revolution. Because EVs, of course, are going to be a huge part of the answer of what to do with all that energy that you need to move around, during the day, and even to some extent over multiple days. So if all those things line up, I think that's going to sort of shrink the space for the needed, nuclear or natural gas with CCS. And it's just really like, I think I feel like both of us probably in our honest moments would admit, I have no fucking idea what's gonna happen. I really have no idea.
That's what I was going to say. No one does, and that's sort of the bottom of these debates about energy projections and what technology will look like sort of 20 or even 5 or 10 years from now. And again, like we probably end up in a very similar practical position, which is, so we should be pushing the technologies we have today and sort of radically innovating and commercializing, not just on next generation nuclear reactors or the next generation CCS and direct air capture stuff, but the next generation solar plants and the next generation batteries.
I will say, I wanted to say this if I ever got on a podcast with you, because I feel like I've been grumpy about Breakthrough over the years. So I did want to say that I have come around, in part due to your guys' work and a lot of other similar work. I have come around on. I mean, I think I always would have said, as I think anybody would say if you ask them, like, should we research a bunch more? Everybody's going to say yes, of course. Like, but I have come around to, I'd say, a more genuine enthusiasm for a real program of innovation, right? I think we're finally, maybe, I knock on wood, past the idiotic fucking argument we were having over innovation versus deployment in the 2010s or whatever, or whatever that was.
Don't jinx it.
And now everyone agrees with what was obvious all along, which is that we need to max out both. But I've got a lot more genuine and sort of enthusiasm and kind of like a vision now of a serious innovation program. Part of it is like, it's not just nuclear or these sort of alternatives to the programs we have going, but like this notion of like devoted research centers, like one devoted to industrial decarbonization. Like, that's just, fuck yeah, we need that. Why do we not have that already? And like one on air travel or whatever. Like, there's so much. I think I didn't, like everyone, I sort of like began this game, kind of obsessively focused on electricity, kind of like coal was what was happening and all the exciting renewables are in electricity. And so I've had sort of electricity centric focus, but over the years, especially recently, I kind of like gotten a deeper appreciation of how much is beyond that and how much is unsolved beyond that and remains to be solved with it. So like researching, how to decarbonize air travel or heavy industry or like shipping or concrete, there's just so much great research to be done. So many smart people ready to do it. And like, like all that's needed is some money and organization. So I will say, I do in part credit you guys for sort of like beating that drum long enough that I've come around a little bit.
Oh, I mean, well, thank you for saying that. Obviously, we were not alone, but that was sort of a founding sort of vision of Breakthrough. I have largely enjoyed the sort of innovation versus deployment conversations, just because I do think that those conversations get us to moments and ones like this, obviously with a lot of frustration along the way. So one last thing, I want to try and tie a bunch of this conversation together with one last question that I think you'll enjoy. So, like I sort of suggested at the top, I'm genuinely thrilled about, to actually put it in practical terms, so the Niskanen Center, Republic EN, R Street, and this other sort of, I think, genuinely impressive, right, libertarian-leaning coalition of outfits out there today pushing for a sort of non-left climate policy and politics. They're not all the same. Sort of ClearPath is different in a particular way than the others. But my question is, with all of those folks and those organizations in mind, are they right that we basically just need a carbon tax?
What is it who is it at the Niskanen Center who's always saying necessary and sufficient? Joe
Mike at the Niskanen
just to troll
Center.
Me, just because he knows it bugs me. No. I mean, seriously, of course not. No, we do not just need a carbon tax. I think that's crazy. Like those, I want to articulate, like, I think a lot of people have the impression that I just hate conservatives and don't want them involved and just like crap on the whole thing. So I want to sort of articulate why I'm skeptical about that stuff. So like one part of it is the motive force for the U.S. conservative movement today, and arguably at the base level for decades now, is the preservation of white, suburban and rural, male, Christian, patriarchal hegemony, right? I mean, this is just like, to me, it should have been super obvious by now. To me, it was obvious if you looked under the hood. Maybe that's the wrong metaphor. If you scratch the surface, you could see that at any point in the last several decades. But now, like it's like the boil has burst, and it's right there on the surface. It seems undeniable at this point that like all libertarian principle or fiscal conservative principle, it turned out was just vaporous. It was tissue paper. It dissolved instantly when a strongman showed up, which indicates to me that it was never particularly core to the whole effort in the first place. It was always something. Fiscal conservatism fights to protect the status quo. So if you're in charge and if you're on top and the status quo, great, you get to appear fiscal libertarian like you're a principled guy. But look, when like the hegemony is threatened, when the privilege is threatened, all of a sudden, all those principles go out the window with zero regret, right? All of a sudden, you want to subsidize coal, you want to subsidize, SUVs, like you want to subsidize your lifestyle, your life, your culture is what they want. So that to me is very clearly obvious now. So what is the public? What is the constituency? What is the force, to return to our original question in this podcast? What power, what brigades do these people command? What power do they have? What constituency is there on the right for genuine, principled, right, fiscal conservatism? My answer to that is virtually nothing. It's a froth. It's a froth, mostly located in DC think tanks, and there's almost no public constituency for that kind of talk or that kind of philosophy. So I just think they have a voice and a presence in U.S. culture and U.S. conversation that is wildly out of proportion to their actual numbers or influence or power. Like they just, maybe you can see it on a multi-decade timeline out ahead, some story by which the current sort of ethno-nationalist, proto-fascist right wing self-destructs or like shrinks to the point that it can't win anymore. And there's some process of reconstruction whereby a different kind of conservative party or a different kind of Republican Party emerges out of the rubble and maybe is once again principled fiscal conservatives. But that's a long way off. And until then, why are we giving these people so much attention? Why are we trying to shape national policy around them? They just don't represent anyone, and they don't represent good policy. Like there's no policy rationale for only doing a carbon tax. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I hope I'm not having to convince you this whole notion that like this whole libertarian notion that any time the government tries to regulate or legislate or invest, which is literally the three things governments do, that it screws up. I just think that's nonsense. It's historically demonstrable nonsense that like governments have adeptly guided things like this before, as you guys have written about a million times. So I just like, the philosophy doesn't have any appeal to me, doesn't make any sense, doesn't seem particularly compelling. There's no power behind it. There's no constituency or power behind it. So why do we give them so much attention? That's what I want to know.
No, and I obviously agree with you on the sort of the role of the government in technological and infrastructural transformations. And I did sort of pose the question that way, at least partially just to trigger you.
It worked. It's so easy.
But no, like I do come out of it differently. I look at, again, sort of Niskanen, ClearPath, Republic EN, R Street, some of these other and often rather new organizations. And they are at least attempting to create a climate or environmental politics in addition to a bunch of other issues. That is, I don't know if it's more moderate or more libertarian, or it, sort of depends on the person and the organization you're describing. Sort of a non sort of 21st century U.S. progressive left environmental politics. And if those efforts are successful, which it sounds like you are not optimistic about, then it actually does sort of create space for enduring coalitions where, whether it's in the next election or 3 elections from now that you have another Republican in the White House or another Republican Congress, you actually do have at least an elite consensus in DC. Or at least an elite constituency in DC, and hopefully an elite, and hopefully a broader constituency and consensus around environmental policy and politics that can actually sort of accelerate the technological and environmental progress that we need.
Well, let me just end with a suggestive. I'll just throw out a suggestive note here. The Niskanen people, I have tons of respect for them. I love Jerry Taylor dearly. Will Wilkinson, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely one of the smartest guys working today. His work on density and polarization is just amazing. I love all those guys. And furthermore, I love the shtick. I love the idea. So I'll just say that a climate policy that is both ambitious, but also informed by legitimate libertarian concerns about overreach or regulatory complexity or regulatory capture, all these sort of like the legitimate concerns down at the core of libertarianism, if you clear away all the cultural cruft. A climate policy informed by those concerns would A, not look just like a carbon tax and nothing else, but B, should such a thing emerge, I would be totally on board with that. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Like the whole Niskanen line of like, the libertarians are wrong in that you need a big social safety net, right? To get the social buy-in to support capitalism. But you also need robust competitive capitalism to generate the wealth, right? To fund the safety net, right? You need them both, and you want to make, like what Denmark does is they have relatively actually few regulations. It's pretty simple and scarce regulatory wise, but a big tax and redistribution system on the back end. You get the best of both worlds. That's kind of the basic Niskanen idea, and I'm totally on board with that. And insofar as a climate policy could be built that would fit along those lines, like I don't think a carbon tax alone will do it. I think you need regulations, but I definitely support the notion that regulations should be as means agnostic, right, or tech agnostic as possible. They should always target the result you want, not individual techs. Right. Like, so I think there's a middle ground there that is both substantively, interesting and politically interesting, but like carbon tax period is not that.
I think that is actually a good place to end it. I would say that depending on the organization, the outfit, it often isn't carbon tax period. You do have a good amount of support for technology policy, and that's where I think a lot of the debate happens, and that's kind of what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, I'm big on technology policy, big on industrial policy, and I would like I guess maybe now's not the time to talk about it, but I'd love to hear like what you guys think of like Jay Inslee's plan, which seems to me like a lot of smart industrial policy put to use.
I am far over our allotted time, but maybe I'll have to have you or somebody else on again to talk about Jay Inslee's plan and actually a bunch of the, I think, sort of very fascinating, at least, and oftentimes very exciting climate and energy plans coming out of the Democratic field. But as you say, that's probably best for another conversation. So with that, I want to thank you, David Roberts, for joining us today.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcast. I want to again thank my guest, David, and our producers, Alyssa Kadalman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.